Mark had always been fascinated by forgotten history and ancient settlements. As a historian, he spent years traveling across remote regions, piecing together the stories of abandoned places. When he heard rumors about an old village called Candlewood, tucked away in the mountains and absent from all historical records, he knew he had to find it. The locals warned him about the village, describing it as cursed and forsaken, a place that shouldn't be disturbed. They claimed that those who ventured into Candlewood returned haunted, their eyes filled with a hollow, faraway look. Ignoring their warnings, Mark set out on a foggy autumn morning, equipped with a map, a flashlight, and his unquenchable curiosity. The trek through the dense forest was grueling, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. As he pushed deeper into the wilderness, an unsettling silence settled around him. No birds sang, and even the rustle of leaves underfoot seemed muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. After hours of navigating the rugged terrain, he stumbled upon a narrow path, overgrown with moss and thorny bushes. At the end of the path, the trees opened up to reveal the outskirts of Candlewood. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he gazed upon the village. It was as though time had stopped. The buildings, though weathered, were largely intact. Cobblestone streets lay hidden beneath a blanket of fallen leaves, and wrought iron lanterns hung from the eaves of old houses, frozen in a long-forgotten era. A chill ran down his spine. The village looked abandoned, yet there was a strange energy in the air, as if the very ground beneath his feet was alive. Pushing down the unease that gnawed at him, Mark took a deep breath and stepped into the village. Little did he know, his journey had just begun, and Candlewood's dark secrets were waiting to be revealed. As Mark walked through the village, he was struck by the silence that enveloped everything. It was not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an unnatural stillness that felt heavy and oppressive. His footsteps echoed off the cobblestones, the only sound breaking the eerie quiet. He scanned the surroundings, noticing that the village seemed remarkably preserved for a place that had been abandoned for over a century. Windows were intact, doors stood ajar, and even the chimneys on some of the houses seemed ready to billow smoke. Yet, there was no sign of life. He approached the nearest house, its wooden door slightly open. Hesitating for a moment, he pushed it open with a creak. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with dusty furniture arranged as if someone had left in a hurry. A table stood in the center, set with plates and utensils, all covered in a thick layer of dust. On the wall hung a faded family portrait, the figures' faces blurred and indistinct, yet their eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. Mark felt a shiver crawl up his spine. There was something profoundly wrong about this place. It was as if the village had been frozen in time, its inhabitants caught in the midst of daily life, then suddenly vanished. He backed out of the house, feeling a sense of intrusion, as if he were trespassing in a place that did not belong to the world he knew. Outside, the air felt colder, and a light mist began to curl through the streets. Mark rubbed his arms, trying to shake off the chill that had settled deep in his bones. As he moved further into the village, he noticed more strange details. Lanterns hung from the buildings, still holding candles that had long since melted into hardened, misshapen forms. Signs over shop doors swung gently in the wind, their painted letters faded but legible. It was as if the village was waiting for its residents to return at any moment. Then, he heard it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. It was a murmur of voices, too soft to make out words, but unmistakably human. Mark froze, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, filling the air around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced around, seeing no one. The streets were empty, the shadows long and still. He took a step back, his instinct screaming that he was not alone. The mist thickened as Mark ventured deeper into Candlewood, swirling around his legs and casting an otherworldly glow over the village. The cobblestones beneath his feet felt slick and cold, as if coated in a fine layer of frost. The air grew denser, pressing against his skin, making it harder to breathe. He felt like he was walking through a dream, each step dragging him further into an unsettling, surreal reality. As he moved, he caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, quick, fleeting shadows darting across the streets and between buildings. He whipped his head around, his flashlight cutting through the mist, but there was nothing there. Only the foggy streets and the silent, watchful houses. His pulse quickened. The shadows were real. He had seen them. But where were they hiding? The whispers returned, louder this time, like a distant conversation that he couldn't quite decipher. They echoed through the village, coming from all directions, disorienting him. Panic bubbled up inside him as he stumbled forward, trying to find a way out of the fog-filled labyrinth. The whispers seemed to follow him, threading through his mind like tendrils of fear. Then, he saw them. Figures began to form in the mist, slowly taking shape as he squinted into the gloom. They were human-like, dressed in clothing from another era, long coats, hats, and dresses that billowed in the faint breeze. Their faces were obscured, hidden by the swirling mist, but he could feel their eyes on him, watching, assessing. He took a step back, heart hammering against his ribs. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice shaky. The figures didn't respond. They simply stood there, their forms shifting and merging with the fog. A cold dread settled over him as he realized that these were not people. They were shadows, remnants of the villagers who had once lived here, trapped in the fabric of Candlewood. The figures began to move, gliding toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Mark turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The whispers followed him, growing louder, a cacophony of voices urging him to stay, to join them in their eternal vigil. He didn't dare look back, fearing what he might see if he did. Mark's frantic flight led him to the center of the village, where an old stone church loomed against the foggy sky. Its bell tower rose high above the other buildings, its weathered stones covered in ivy. The large, wooden door stood slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. With nowhere else to go and the shadows closing in around him, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior of the church was dim, illuminated only by the faint light filtering through the stained glass windows. Rows of wooden pews stretched out before him, covered in dust and cobwebs. At the far end of the room stood an altar, draped in a tattered cloth. Candles sat in holders along the walls, their wicks long extinguished. The air inside was heavy, carrying the scent of old wood and something more acrid, something that made Mark's stomach churn. He approached the altar, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. On the altar lay an ancient-looking book, its leather cover cracked and worn. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before flipping it open. The pages were filled with strange symbols and faded handwriting, records of rituals and ceremonies that he couldn't quite comprehend. His eyes scanned the text, picking out fragments that chilled him to the core. Eternal imprisonment, curse of the land, sacrifice to the shadows. Mark's breath quickened as he realized what the book was describing. The village had been cursed long ago, its inhabitants trapped in a state between life and death. The shadows he had seen were the villagers, condemned to wander the streets for eternity. And now, the village sought new souls to bind to its fate, his soul. As he read, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. He looked up and saw shadows creeping along the walls, moving closer to him. The whispers returned, now echoing through the church with a mournful tone. He backed away from the altar, clutching the book to his chest. The shadows reached out, their forms writhing and stretching across the floor. In a desperate move, Mark bolted for the door, the whispers rising to a fever pitch. He threw open the door and stumbled into the foggy streets, the chill of the air biting into his skin. The shadows linger ###4. The Church of Secrets continued, into his skin. The shadows lingered at the church's entrance, writhing as though bound by some invisible force, unable to cross the threshold. For a moment, he felt a flicker of relief. But as he looked around, he realized that the village itself had changed. The mist was thicker now, twisting into shapes that resembled faces and clawed hands reaching out toward him. Clutching the ancient book, Mark knew he had to find a way to break the curse before he, too, became a shadow wandering these streets forever. His mind raced, searching for clues in the fragments of text he had read. The symbols and words hinted at a ritual, something involving the church, but the exact details were unclear. All he knew was that time was running out, and the village would not let him go so easily. Mark continued to run, the whispers growing louder, almost unbearable. The mist seemed to thicken around him, obscuring his vision and pulling at his clothes like unseen hands. He could feel the presence of the shadows closing in, moving just beyond his line of sight. The village was changing, twisting into a labyrinth designed to trap him. As he stumbled through the fog, he heard a different sound, a voice, distinct and clear amidst the cacophony. It was a woman's voice, soft but commanding. "You must listen," it said. "The curse can be broken, but you must act quickly." Mark spun around, searching for the source of the voice. There was no one there, only the swirling mist and the outlines of the village buildings. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the silent walls. "What do I need to do?" The voice responded, faint and distant as if carried by the wind. "The book holds the key. You must perform the ritual in the heart of the village at the stroke of midnight. It is the only way to free the souls trapped here." Mark's mind raced. Midnight was fast approaching, and he had to find the heart of the village, the place where it all began. He clutched the book, his pulse quickening. The shadows seemed to recoil slightly, as if the voice's words had given him a brief respite. But he knew it wouldn't last. The village was still alive, still intent on claiming him as its own. He sprinted through the twisting streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog pressed in on all sides, making it nearly impossible to see where he was going. In the distance, he glimpsed a tall structure, the village clock tower. It loomed over the rooftops, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. Mark felt a surge of hope. The clock tower had to be the heart of the village. It was the one place he had not yet explored. As he approached, the air grew colder, and the whispers intensified, swirling around him like a storm. The clock's face was cracked and weathered, its hands frozen at 12. Mark shivered, realizing that time had indeed stopped in Candlewood, trapping its residents in an endless cycle. He forced open the tower's heavy wooden door, the creak echoing into the darkness beyond. Inside, a spiral staircase wound upward, vanishing into shadows. Taking a deep breath, he began to climb, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The climb seemed endless, the air growing colder with every step. The shadows at the edge of his vision writhed, reaching toward him as if trying to pull him back. At the top, he emerged into a small, circular room. The floor was marked with strange symbols, carved into the stone and filled with a dark, tar-like substance. In the center of the room stood an old, rusted clock mechanism, its gears motionless. Mark opened the book, frantically scanning the pages for the ritual the voice had spoken of. The words blurred before his eyes, but he forced himself to focus. He needed to perform the ritual before it was too late. Mark knelt in the center of the room, placing the book on the floor. The words and symbols seemed to pulse with a faint light, as if responding to his presence. He began to recite the incantation, his voice trembling with fear and urgency. Outside, the whispers rose to a crescendo, the shadows pressing against the walls of the tower as if trying to break through. As he chanted, the room grew colder, and a swirling wind began to whip around him. The symbols on the floor glowed with an eerie light, casting strange shadows on the walls. Mark's voice wavered, but he forced himself to continue, driven by the knowledge that this was his only chance to escape the village's curse. The wind howled through the room, carrying with it the anguished cries of the trapped villagers. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms stretching toward the center of the room. Mark felt a surge of energy, a dark force pushing against him as if resisting the ritual. He gritted his teeth, shouting the final words of the incantation. The symbols on the floor blazed with light, filling the room with a blinding brilliance. The shadows shrieked, recoiling from the light, their forms dissipating into the air like smoke. The wind ceased, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, Mark heard it, the faint sound of the clock mechanism beginning to tick. The hands of the clock tower's face moved, slowly but steadily, breaking the spell that had held the village in its grasp. Mark collapsed to the floor, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The intense light from the ritual slowly faded, leaving the room in a dim, ghostly glow. The clocks ticking filled the silence, echoing throughout the tower. Mark felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. He had succeeded in breaking the curse. Outside, the air began to change. The dense fog that had swallowed the village started to lift, unraveling like a shroud. Mark glanced out of the tower window and saw the once menacing shadows retreating into the depths of the forest, their forms disintegrating into the morning light. The buildings, which had been frozen in decay, now seemed to take on a different appearance, as if time was finally catching up with them. For a moment, the village stood still, quiet and empty. Then, as if awakening from a long nightmare, a gust of wind swept through the streets, rustling the leaves and stirring the dust that had settled over everything. Mark watched in awe as the village seemed to breathe again, its structures settling into the reality of the present. The silence, which had once been so oppressive, now felt peaceful, almost serene. But his relief was short-lived. As the mist cleared, he noticed figures standing in the streets below, the villagers. They were no longer the twisted shadows he had seen before. Their faces were now visible, pale and gaunt, but with a faint glimmer of recognition and gratitude in their eyes. Mark's heart sank as he realized that although he had broken the curse, the villagers were still trapped, bound to the land by some force beyond his understanding. The voice from earlier whispered through the wind once more. "You have freed them from the shadows, but not from this place. Their fate is tied to the village, and now so is yours." Mark's blood ran cold. He had changed the nature of the curse, but he had not escaped it. The village, though awakened, still held a grip on those within its boundaries. He was now part of Candlewood's story, a guardian of its secrets. Mark descended the tower, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. The villagers stood silently in the streets, their eyes following him as he approached. He could sense their pain, their longing for freedom, and he felt a crushing weight of responsibility. They were no longer mere shadows, but souls with stories and lives that had been stolen by the curse. He opened the book once more, flipping through the pages, searching for anything that might offer a solution. The symbols and texts blurred before his eyes, overwhelming him with their complexity. The whispers returned, softer this time, as if encouraging him to understand. "There is a choice," they seemed to say, "one last chance." Mark found a passage near the back of the book that hinted at a final release, a way to sever the village's connection to the curse. However, it required a sacrifice. A soul willing to remain as the village's keeper, maintaining the balance and preventing the curse from spreading beyond its borders. His heart pounded as the implications sank in. If he performed this final ritual, he could free the villagers, allowing their souls to pass on peacefully. But in doing so, he would bind himself to the village forever, becoming the guardian who watched over its ruins. It was the only way to ensure that the curse did not claim any more lives. He looked at the villagers, their expressions somber yet hopeful. They knew what he was considering. Mark swallowed hard, his mind racing. Could he do it? Could he give up his life to save them, to ensure that the village's darkness remained contained? Taking a deep breath, Mark made his decision. He knelt in the center of the street, opening the book to the ritual's final passage. The villagers gathered around, their forms faintly glowing in the early morning light. Mark began to recite the incantation, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. As he chanted, a warmth spread through the air, pushing back the lingering cold that had haunted Candlewood for so long. The ground beneath him trembled, and a golden light enveloped the village, casting away the last remnants of shadow. The villagers raised their heads, their faces softening with peace. One by one, they began to dissolve into the light, their forms turning to wisps of mist that drifted skyward. Tears welled up in Mark's eyes as he watched them go. He felt a sense of profound sorrow and relief wash over him. The curse was breaking, releasing the souls that had been bound to the village for centuries. The whispers faded into silence, leaving behind an overwhelming stillness. The light around Mark grew brighter, encasing him in its warmth. He felt a pull at his core, an ancient force binding him to the village. As the light dimmed, he stood alone in the street, the book clutched in his hands. The village around him had transformed. The buildings were now ruins, overtaken by nature. Candlewood was no longer a prison of shadows, but a peaceful, forgotten place hidden deep within the mountains. Mark knew that he had become the village's keeper, the guardian of its secrets. He would remain here, watching over Candlewood and ensuring that its curse stayed buried. It was a heavy burden, but he accepted it, knowing that he had freed the souls that had been trapped for so long. If this haunting tale of the town that time forgot kept you on edge, make sure to hit subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Don't forget to ring the notification bell to join us on our next journey into the unknown. Have you ever encountered a place that seemed frozen in time or whispered secrets in the wind? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, give us a thumbs up to let us know. Remember, some places hold more than just history. They hold the souls of those who can never leave.